Greetings, everyone. What I'm about to tell you will be important in explaining what the USA is doing in the Caribbean. Let me say, I am not a real person. I am AI generated. However, the information I am presenting was researched by a real person. Please subscribe to the Jamrock's learning journey. Now let us get started. There's a 200-year-old foreign policy, one that was originally a warning to European empires that has been dramatically brought back to life for the 21st century. So today we've got to ask, how is the Monroe Doctrine being reshaped to reassert American dominance? And what does that actually mean for the countries living in its shadow? Wow. I mean, it doesn't get much clearer than this, right? This quote from the US State Department, that's not just diplomatic jargon, it's a declaration of ownership. It really sets the stage for a whole new era of American intervention in what it considers its own backyard. This isn't just talk. The source material we're digging into today paints a pretty chilling picture of where this policy could go. Let me also say that over 100 sources were explored in the creation of this video. Now, just imagine this for a second. It's January 3rd, 2026, and US forces have just rolled into Venezuela and captured President Nicolas Maduro. An action like that would signal that the days of subtle influence are totally over and an era of direct intervention is here. So how did we get to a point where something like that is even on the table? Well, this isn't some brand new idea. It's a powerful revival of a very old one to really get what's happening. Now we have to go back. We have to look at the original Monroe Doctrine and see how it evolved into what some people are now calling the Monroe Doctrine. So it all started way back in 1823. President James Monroe basically stood up and drew a line in the sand. The message to Europe was simple. The Americas are closed for business. No more colonization, no more interference. This single policy established the Western Hemisphere as a U.S. sphere of influence, and it became a cornerstone of American foreign policy for the next 2 centuries. Now, for a long time, the doctrine was mostly just a warning, but that all changed around the turn of the 20th century. This is when the speak softly part of that famous phrase got a lot quieter, and the big stick came out in a big way. Welcome to the era of gunboat diplomacy. Man, was it a busy time? It all kicked off with the Spanish-American War, which left the U.S. in control of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Then, just a few years later, the U.S. helped engineer Panama's independence just so it could build the canal and the cherry on top. Theodore Roosevelt's corollary, which basically gave the U.S. an official license to act as an international police power, kicking off decades of military interventions all over the region. This whole period became known pretty bluntly as the Banana Wars, and that term, it just gets right to the point, doesn't it? These interventions weren't just about abstract political ideas. They were military actions designed to protect American business interests, especially these powerful fruit companies that had huge influence over US policy. So the motivations here were a real mix. Securing the Panama Canal was huge, of course, but so were the massive plantations owned by companies like the United Fruit Company. And to protect all these interests, the US military actually occupied sovereign nations like Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. While the US might have called it ensuring SDI, the nations on the receiving end, well, they had a different name for it, Yankee imperialism. Let's fast forward to today. After decades of taking a different approach, this old playbook is back and it's been retooled for the 21st century. This is the era of what's being called the Monroe Doctrine. So what's the big idea here? Well, this modern policy takes the original concept of the Monroe Doctrine, hemispheric dominance, and it gives it a 21st century upgrade. It's an explicit out-in-the-open strategy to reestablish the U.S. as the unchallenged military and economic power in the region. Listen, this isn't just someone's interpretation. Secretary of War Pete Hedge said that, laid it out loud and clear. The language is all right there. Restore military dominance, protect our homeland, and secure access to key terrain. That is the old historical doctrine speaking through a very modern voice. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Who is the modern-day empire that this new doctrine is aimed at? It's not a European power anymore, it's China. The whole strategy is about controlling strategic assets, fighting cartels, and using economic muscle, things like tariffs and sanctions, to make sure regional governments fall in line and don't get too cozy with outside powers. Okay, but a doctrine of dominance isn't just words on paper, right? It has real world consequences. So let's shift our focus now and look at the human and political cost for the nations who are actually on the receiving end of this assertive policy. This really shows you the two main tools in the toolbox: hard power and economic power. For a country like Venezuela, the playbook calls for a direct military assault to take out a leader and control oil. For Cuba, it's economic strangulation, an oil blockade designed to completely cripple the country's electrical grid and its economy. The impact is just severe. We're talking about the United Nations itself, warning that this economic pressure is pushing Cuba towards a full-blown humanitarian collapse. This isn't some political chess move. It has devastating consequences for millions of ordinary people. But the policy's impact isn't just felt in other countries. Take Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory. After hurricanes Irma and Maria, the federal response was slammed for being slow and unequal compared to the aid that mainland states got. It really raised some tough questions about who is considered inside this sphere of American protection. And you have to understand these disparities were sitting on a foundation of extreme vulnerability. Before the hurricanes even made landfall, Puerto Rico had a staggering poverty rate of 44%. That's triple the mainland average. This kind of economic fragility meant that an unequal disaster response was going to be absolutely catastrophic. Even U.S. immigration policy has become a tool in this for Haitians living in the U.S. under temporary protected status, which allows people from countries in crisis to stay that protection was suddenly terminated. This move basically made thousands of people who had built their lives in the U.S. eligible for deportation overnight, even with all the instability back in their home country. So did this aggressive approach work? Did it unite the hemisphere behind the U.S.? Well, not exactly. Instead, it seems to have created deep divisions and some serious political fallout. Just look at what happened when the Organization of American States voted on suspending Venezuela. The Caribbean community was completely split down the middle. Some nations voted with the US, others voted against, and a whole bunch just tried to stay out of it. It's such a clear picture of a region completely fractured by us. Pressure. The resistance is definitely getting more vocal. This is a really powerful statement from Colombian President Gustavo Petro, which came after a US strike against alleged drug traffickers. It gives a raw voice to this rising sense of outrage and anti-American feeling that's bubbling up across Latin America. This right here reveals the central irony of this entire strategy. The stated goal is to limit foreign influence, especially China's, but the heavy-handed tactics, they seem to be doing the exact opposite. They're pushing nations away from the US and straight toward other global partners, partners who offer investment without all the political strings. And today, China is now the main trading partner for a growing number of countries in South America, which leaves us with this one critical question. As the world becomes more and more competitive, a policy of just going it alone and demanding dominance might get you some short-term wins. But if the long-term result is a loss of influence, a loss of trust, and a loss of partnership, what's the true cost?